think is always picked up. In some of the press releases and the coverage that happens, is that it's really important that we still risk assess any activity that we are planning to hold. Mae fe'n bwysig ofnadw bod ni yn, mae fe'n gofyniad bod ni yn asesu, wneud asesiad o risg unrhyw digwyddiad I ni ar fin ailgychwyn. It's a requirement, it will be a requirement, it is now a requirement to work through a risk assessment for the various activities that we're planning. So there is obviously still a risk. We still need to make sure that we consider certain things to keep everyone safe and actually to ensure that we can continue to run activities for as long as possible. We're really not out of the woods yet. Felly mae fe dal yn bwysig bod ni yn ystyried beth allwn ni wneud I gadw pawb yn saff. Felly allwn ni barhau gweithgareddau yn y dyfodol. So just want to move on to just consider, just to cover some of those key considerations. Ni nawr yn mynd I symud mlaen I ystyried rhai o'r prif pethau dylen ni fod yn edrych ar wneud o nawr mlaen. And then we'll move on to cover some of the questions. So just a little reminder, please make sure you pop your questions in the chat column. Felly, awn ni mlaen wedyn I edrych ar cwestiynau. Felly, rhowch eich cwestiynau yn y column chat. Felly, Donna, do you want to take us through some of the things that we should still be considering when we're looking at organising activities, meetings, events in the future?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Diolch, Hazel. So just a quick recap for some of you who might not have come to our previous webinars either. So the community venue premises managers will need to have conducted a building risk assessment to make sure you have everything you need in place, especially if the building's been shut for any length of time. Also now might be an ideal opportunity to review and update it. Recent changes to government guidance has increased indoor numbers for organised gatherings. So as it stands at the moment, 1,000 seated or 200 standing, though by no means are these a target because it will depend on how large your building is, how large your function rooms are, etc. And again, the situations may change again if infection rates continue to rise. It's also envisaged, as Hazel said, face coverings indoors will remain mandatory. But bear in mind, something I know that it's been a challenge for other sectors when, for example, visitors from England are visiting. And of course, it's no longer mandatory in England, is it? And it has been quite a challenge. So have a think about how we're going to approach and encourage the use of face coverings indoors and reminding people. Social distancing may no longer be a legal requirement outdoors, but we need to be mindful of potential pinch points to the building. So if people are gathering outside, queuing, ready to come in, so try to remind people, whether by signage or verbally, to continue to encourage the 2-metre social distancing outside when queuing and gathering. And it's still really important to keep a register of attendees. So this is for the track and trace reasoning. And Ceredigion, it's something we're quite proud of is the way that our track and trace provision has worked. So it's still really important. But one of the most important things with regard to our control measures inside a building continues to be ventilation and hygiene. So keeping your windows open, keeping your doors open, but being careful if they're fire doors not to wedge them open. So those are the sort of ventilation thoughts that we'd like to keep close to our minds. And also with regard to hygiene, it's not just the disinfecting of touch points, etc., but also reminding people how important it is to maintain the hand washing that we're getting into the swing of nowadays. A few people have mentioned LFDs, and they seem to be increasingly used. You might be considering using or recommending LFD testing as an additional control measure, but be very mindful that these are voluntary, not mandatory. And if you're thinking of including them in your risk assessment, you would need to have everybody sign up and agree to use them, bearing in mind they're well within their rights to refuse to carry out an LFD test. So when you're looking at the hirers of your venues, so that's the people who come to use your rooms, they'll need to continue to provide you with their risk assessments and taking note of the safety measures that you've got in place in your building. So having a look at your risk assessment and identifying what risks and potential control measures they need to think about, depending on what their activity is. We also need to be quite mindful as well how these people will be travelling to and from activities, because we're still trying to recommend that car sharing is avoided wherever possible when you've got people from different households in a small space like that. So bilingual risk assessment templates for the building and for the hirer have been updated, and they're available on the council website, as is a new checklist for you to use as premises managers. It's up to you how you use this checklist. You can refer to it regularly or actually tick the boxes, keep it as a bit of an aid memoir, use it as often as you wish to provide reassurance to yourselves and hirers that standards continue to be monitored and maintained, and you're committed to the reduction of the risk of the spread of COVID. I hope that was clear enough. And as Hazel said, we can discuss this afterwards and any questions that you may have.
Diolch Donna, thank you. I can see a few questions flowing in. Fi'n gallu gweld ambell i gwestiwn yn dod trwyddo. One of the other things that is really important to remind everybody of, Donna, as well, in everything that we've seen and we've read so far about the potential changes, it doesn't say anything about dropping the need to collect the contact details of those attending your events. So it's still really, really important that we safely gather and securely gather the details of attendees and keep them for up to 21 days, I think, isn't it? But yeah, it's still important that we consider how we collect that detail, because I think we're still in the position where passing a pen from one person to the next probably isn't advisable. So have a think about that, because it is still really important that we gather details on who is attending, when they're attending, and what the best way of contacting people is, because contact tracing is still very much a part of the process moving forward. Felly mae fe dal yn bwysig bod ni'n cadw ac yn casglu manylion y rhai sy'n mynychu gweithgareddau fel rhan o'r system profi olrhain a diogelu. Lowri, ti wedi bod yn cadw llygad ar y cwestiynau? Have you been keeping an eye on some of the questions coming through? Any themes?
Yeah, diolch Hazel. A number of questions in the chat box, and I think, as Hazel mentioned at the beginning, if we don't get round to answering all of your questions, or if we notice at the end of the meeting that we've missed a question that you've posted in the chat box, we will make sure that we get back to you with a response to that question. But yeah, certainly there are some themes. I think a couple of the first questions Donna has already answered in her summary, but I suppose just to clarify once more, a question is around will there be need to keep 2 metre social distancing indoors? That was the first question.
So with regard to these social distancing indoors, yes, it's something that will be maintained. And I realise some of some of our buildings, you might have smaller rooms. So when you've got people asking to hire a room, it'd be useful to think about, what their maximum numbers are, depending on which you might have an option of a few rooms to use. So really, it's the larger rooms you should be thinking of. Is this the same from Catherine? Is this the same question regarding outdoor events? Right, so outdoor events, where there is no legal requirement for social distancing, but we do need to be careful that people aren't congregating and being too close still. So with regards to outside, it'll be difficult to monitor and enforce, isn't it, Avion? There's been quite a lot of discussions about how we support and enforce events outside. More difficult when you're not sort of backed up by legislation.
I think one of the key points, it comes back to what was mentioned, is the responsibility to carry out a risk assessment and what measures you identify in that risk assessment in order to reduce the risk of spread. And the likelihood is that social distancing will still be a key point in your own risk assessment, and social distancing then may well limit the numbers which are practically able to be had inside the venue, although the legislation will be saying the limits will be lifted. That is subject to your risk assessment, and that risk assessment, is probably going to result in you setting your own limit, if you like, for that building to make sure that distancing can be achieved.
If we're looking at outside activities that we're organising as well, it's looking at your pinch points where people will, you think they're going to be shoulder to shoulder, so entrances by any sort of external toilets, or if they're having to come in to use the toilets. There's a lot to think about really, where people aren't able to stay far away from other people very easily. Sorry, Hazel.
No, thank you. And it is, I agree completely with some of the comments that are coming through on the chat. It is a confusing space at the moment because, as Avion quite rightly said, we're expecting the legislation to change from Saturday onwards, so that there's no legal requirement to physically distance. But then we are still meant to be, it's not gone away. COVID is still with us. The case levels are stubbornly not reducing very much. So as people who bring others together in our communities, I think it's really important, isn't it, that we do what we can to keep everyone safe, and that's where the risk assessment comes in, because for some instances it isn't particularly practical to think about or to suggest that people distance. So there might be other things that we put in place to make sure that people are safe, whether we limit numbers instead, or I know that some places have looked at tables, so people congregate, so smaller groups of people congregate around tables rather than everybody mixing. But it is now about best practice, and we do still need to be safe and conscious of the fact that we still have cases in our communities across Ceredigion, particularly at the moment when people are coming and going and people are travelling, then we all know, don't we, that things can change dramatically overnight. So it is still best practice to think about what we can do to maintain a little distance, because some of the people who are coming to events and activities might also feel a little more comfortable if they were outside in a smaller crowd. Or if there was some kind of distancing involved. So it's important for us to consider all of that. Laurie, unrhyw?
A couple of other questions around the use of kitchen facilities at community venues and halls, and what's the advice around sort of safe use of those facilities, I guess.
So the less people you have using these kitchens, because they typically are small, and where you've got the activity areas like the washing up sink, like the water boiler, like around the fridge, you don't want people in there. So the less people you have in there, the better. And I know there's questions about luncheon clubs, children's parties, etc., because the children's parties don't come under the sort of formal regulated gatherings as compared to other activities we'd be talking about. So if we were bringing in homemade food from different people's houses, or one family being responsible for sharing this food, you could imagine the sort of infection fallout if people in that family had a positive test and they had been the sole people sharing that food. If we are looking at providing food, the lower risk would be from a proper, licensed and insured supplier where things are packed, they've got their food hygiene certificates and all the rest of it. So you'd know that there'd be a minimum set of requirements and hygiene to hand that food out. And where we've looked at having activities in other areas, they've organised how they're taking the food to people. So asking people to remain seated, bring their own plate and take that plate home with them, etc., or disposable paper plates. So there are risk mitigating measures, but then have another think of who's going to be responsible of cleaning that kitchen, cleaning the touch points afterwards, because it's like a risk assessment in itself. You've got to weigh up the amount of work and responsibility you put into it to the outcome. If the outcome is going to be excellent, it's going to be worthwhile, a lot of people are going to be at huge advantage of it. It might be worth putting all that extra work, time and money into something if it's going to have the desired positive outcome. So it would require some pretty in-depth risk assessing in itself using the kitchens.
So that's a good suggestion, Donna, isn't it? Well, again, depending on the size of the kitchen you're working with and working from, just limit the number of people who are in and out and who are involved in the preparation and the distribution of the food. So have a small team helping out, which makes perfect sense. Any other questions? Unrhyw cwestiwn eraill, Lori?
There's another question, and I think this is a question we've had at previous sessions as well, so it might be worth us just clarifying. It's in regards to TTP and recording that information, and a question from somebody on the call was around, is it the hall hirers, so those leading the activities, or the hall managers, so those responsible for the building itself, responsible for keeping that track and trace information that's collected from sessions and events and things?
Again, it's the person arranging the activity, isn't it? Or the session or the meeting. So as a venue, if you're hiring your hall to somebody else, it's the responsibility of the person running the activity or running the event or running the meeting. It's not yours as the owner of the building, unless you were arranging something yourself. So it's the direct responsibility of whoever's in charge.
And then excellent. I think finally, just one other question I think that I've noticed in the chat box was around the length of the session that's hosted, possibly indoors. And I think that's another mitigating factor, isn't it, Donna? The length of the session. Naturally, the shorter the session, the less risk that comes with that session. That's still the sort of advice that would be provided, wouldn't it?
Potentially, yes. And as long as you leave enough of a break to have some air changes in between each activity and a chance to clean down, etc. So, most activities, in your venues aren't going to be more than an hour or two anyway. So that'll all form part of your risk assessment. But certainly, if you normally have something that lasts an hour and you've got something else starting straight after, you probably have to think about allowing a quarter of an hour or so to open all the doors and the windows and disinfect the touch points.
Yeah. I ni gyd yn gwybod gyda cyfarfodydd, we all know that with some meetings, actually keeping it short is probably a good thing, isn't it? Sticking to the agenda, sticking to the key points, keeping meetings as short as possible. It makes sense, doesn't it? Lori, nes I weld sylw gyda fach, fi'n credu, yn dod trwy'r column. I think I saw somebody mention a little earlier about the barcode, the QR code. And what's really interesting, I think we've covered this in one of our previous sessions, and I hadn't realised this, but the QR code isn't a replacement for keeping a list of attendees. So So you still need to keep a list of those who are part of or take part in your activities or who are attending your event. The QR code in itself isn't enough. And I noticed, I think somebody mentioned as well, whether we needed to do the same for outdoor activities, whether we need to keep a list of attendees for outdoor activities.
Sorry, could you repeat that? It cut up a little bit on me.
Sorry, Eifion. Ar gyfer gweithgareddau tu fas, for outdoor activities, do we still need to keep a list of attendees for track and trace?
As a regulated event, I would say yes, it's always beneficial to do that because, you know, if you go back to the reason for it, rather than seeing it as, you know, an additional piece of work that needs to be done, that's what needs to be borne in mind at all times, really, is why it's been brought in and why it's being done. And that would be the same whether the event is outdoors or indoors. What we don't know as yet is what the regulations will state when they come out on the weekend as to whether that is something that is enforceable or not. But I would encourage people to carry on doing it regardless at this moment in time, given the infection rates haven't come down, as you mentioned earlier, really.
There was another question about the use of masks when they're taking part in exercise activities. And there is a guidance document out there, government guidance about exercise. And what is recommended is that when you enter the building, you wear your mask. You keep your mask on until you just start the exercise. So again, it's making sure that you place all of the people who are undertaking or taking part in this exercise, making super sure that they are 2 meters apart. As you can imagine, any sort of strenuous activity, you're going to be breathing heavier and with the sort of moving around, etc. So yeah, leaving the masks on until last minute. And then as soon as that exercise session's finished, they put their masks on when they're leaving as well.
And I'm assuming, Donna, that we might hear a little more detail about face coverings following Friday's announcement, because we already know that they will still be mandatory in public places. And of course, village halls, community facilities, some of the events that we are organising will be public space. Again, as you say, Donna, I assume for all activities, we will still be looking at the use of face coverings.
And I think as managers of these premises as well, it's well within your rights to say in your building risk assessment that, you know, these are the control measures that we want, and wearing the face mask when you enter and when you leave, you know, is part of that as well. So again, it's another reason why these risk assessments are important, because it shows that you're being reasonable, responsible, and you're committed to keeping everybody safe.
And I think there was a question coming through as well to clarify the QR code attendance list. You definitely need to keep a separate attendance list. Do you also have to have a QR code?
I don't think it's mandatory that you have to, but
the attendance list is.
Yeah, I think the QR code issue enables the app to be able to sort of, so it's helpful in terms of being able to get hold of people and pinging people, but the attendance list is, yeah, is the prime sort of thing that we're after. Where there are household groups and what have you, then, you know, the prime sort of household person is what is required there, rather than every single individual. But yeah, it's key that we can get hold of people should an outbreak occur somewhere, that we can trace the people who are at that event, really.
Diolch, Eifion. Unrhyw beth arall trwy ddolwri?
There was one other question in regards to guidance available for venues who possibly haven't reopened yet and may potentially be looking at reopening their venue. And I know Tuleri's looking at sharing the link for the Ceredigion webpage, where we've got, as Donna mentioned, a very useful checklist and various risk assessment templates that should be useful for anybody looking for additional advice there.
Diolch Laurie. And I noticed a comment that's come in as well about, you know, people not signing lists, and I guess when you're arranging a meeting or an activity, it's fairly easy, isn't it? You're dealing, again, it's easier when you're dealing with smaller numbers of people. So I think that again is the logistics of working with fewer people. It just makes things a lot easier. But we have to do what we can to make sure that we still have comprehensive lists of people that may have been in contact with each other.
If I may, Hazel, that is one of the things that needs to be considered when you're planning an event, really, is how are you going to gather this information? Because just leaving a sheet of A4 by the doorway is not going to be good enough. You know, you're going to need to say somebody is responsible for making sure that information is gathered and is kept. So you know, that needs to be thought of, really, again, as part of the risk assessment in a way. You know, it's all part and parcel of how do we control the risk, really, and not only while people are on the venue, but subsequently as well. So I think that is a key point. And it may well be that, you know, people do need to make it clear that, you know, if people don't wish to abide by your rules for your venue, then why should they be allowed to enter your venue? You know, so you know, that point needs to be made, you know, and I'm sure the same applies for even pre-COVID things about what they should and shouldn't be doing whilst they are on your venue. This should be regarded as a term and condition, if you like, of coming in.
I can come in there as well. Some activities and events that have been organised, they've actually looked at how they've organised the bookings, which has helped with the track and trace. So it could be, you know, if you're selling a ticket, that you take all of their details then, because, you know, they're passing the money over. If they're going to cancel and they'll be wanting their money back, you can take them off that list then. It could be that, you know, as part of a stamp to get into like an outdoor festival or show or something like that. And as they're being stamped, so you've got somebody at the gate managing the pinch points and getting everybody's information. There's a few ways that, you know, looking creatively at how we can get people's information. But as Avon said, and Hazel said, how important it is to make sure we know who is attending these places in the event of an outbreak.
Sylwadau diddorol yn dod trwyddo hefyd ynglyn â gwisgo magydau mewn cyfarfodydd. Some interesting comments coming through about wearing face coverings at meetings. And again, you know, if it's a meeting where, depends on the room, depends on the ventilation, but if it's a public place, then face coverings are still and will still be a requirement. And if somebody can't wear a face covering, then I think that full physical distancing is really important to keep those individuals safe. Because I think it's still important for us to recognise that there will still be people who will be very, very anxious and cautious about getting back to meetings, getting back to different activities and social events, if we're not doing all that we can to keep everyone safe. So if we choose not to wear a face covering, it might make somebody else in the meeting really uncomfortable. Yeah, it's from Saturday onwards, it feels that the responsibility is going to shift somewhat, isn't it, from government and from legislation to what we need to do. I think the responsibility will be ours as individuals. And I think really important for us in the community to be setting the right tone and making sure that we're sharing best practice. Really interesting comment as well about, I think there was something about certificates, vaccine certificates. Do you remember where that one was, Laurie?
It was around, I think it was a question around whether organisations or businesses will ask for certification of vaccines.
And if I recall rightly, we can't at the moment, can we? We can't insist on that anyway at the moment. But one of the interesting things that has been mentioned in the past about proof of being vaccinated, about lateral flow test results. If you're asking people to show you that proof, then that could in itself create a bit of a bottleneck. That adds to the time that people are together, and that could add to the time that it takes to get people through a system into an event. But at the moment, currently, I don't think we can insist that everybody that attends an event is fully vaccinated. Dwi ddim yn meddwl ar hyn o bryd bod yr hawl gyda ni I holi to beth, but things change, mae pethau yn newid, felly mae'n bwysig iawn bod ni'n cadw yn llyged ar unrhyw datblygiadau. Really important that we keep an eye out for any development. But at the moment, I don't think we're allowed, that we can ask for that information. Am I right, Donna, Avion?
Yeah, I think the proof will be in the pudding, if you like, in terms of what comes out after Mr. Drakeford's announcements on Friday, and what changes happen in the regulations themselves. So we're a little bit not 100% certain on that, really, and we will have to wait and see. And no doubt we will put something out there to notify people as soon as we're aware if anything changes on that front.
Mm. Yeah, because there's always talk about it, isn't there? Vaccine certificates, and so yeah, we'll keep an eye on that one. Unrhyw beth arall, Laurie?
There was a question in regards to choirs and instrumental groups. What is the latest position for those sort of groups and events? Choirs and instrumental groups, yeah.
Again, as I understand it, Donna, as we move to alert level 0, fel ni'n symud I lefel rhybydd dim, mae all popeth ail ddechrau, everything can restart and start again. But I know that there are some interesting little things that can be done with choirs and in any kind of instrumental practice to limit any potential risks. And I know that many are still continuing to practice and to perform outdoors. While we have decent weather, obviously that's a really good option, isn't it?
It is, and there's some quite imaginative ways that people have adopted different ways of practicing together, etc. So we've seen risk assessments from choirs who've been performing back to back, so they're not facing each other. Again, outside, and different ways of standing, etc. So that there's none of this sort of air crossing over, because you can imagine having to wear a mask. Singing isn't going to bring the best out in anybody's voice. With regards to the instruments, it's interesting because when the guidance came out 2 or 3 months ago, they were talking about whether you're using sort of woodwind, where you'd be blowing harsh into an instrument and comparing it to guitars, etc. But at the same time, any sort of loud music, and you've got groups listening to them, you're going to have to raise your voice to be heard. So there are different risks involved. And even if we do go down to alert level 0, it would be prudent to put control measures in place, because you know that the risks, are elevated when it comes to loud music, sort of wind-blown instruments, etc. So better safe than sorry, and still keeping sort of suitable control measures in that risk assessment to show that you've the additional risks.
And that's where distancing comes in, isn't it? And the size of venue, and as you said quite rightly at the very beginning, Donna, ventilation, keeping doors, keeping windows open, so you've got plenty of air circulating if you are indoors. But yeah, find those big spaces if you've got a brass band or a big choir. Da iawn. Unrhyw arall yn dod trwyddo, Lowri?
I think that largely covers the questions, but once we save the chat, we'll be able to see in case we have missed any in between. We can get back to those.
There's a statement there, a question they're asking about business. Should they display their risk assessment checklist? It should be completely down to yourselves if you'd want people to see it, but as it is, it's a working document for you to sort of for a risk management working document, and you might want to add things, you might want to delete things, etc., whatever applies to you. But it's up to you if you feel comfortable sharing that with the hirers or anything like that.
But I guess if I've interpreted the legislation correctly, anybody could ask to see your risk assessment, and you could ask anyone, any business, any cafe, any restaurant, any pub, anywhere you go, you can ask to see their risk assessment, because that is a requirement. And I think lots of people have forgotten that actually they should have something on paper that shows how they are keeping staff, customers, attendees, people in the community safe.
We would encourage people to share their risk assessment with each other. It's the risk assessment checklist more than anything. As again, it's up to yourselves as premises managers if you want to keep that for the public to see or share it. But as Hazel said, your risk assessment should be shared with your hirers, and you'd want to see your hirers' risk assessment in return too.
So yeah, you can ask, isn't it, Avion? Anybody can ask.
Credu bod e'n bwysig bod asesiad risg yn ei le, a bod chi'n meddwl amdano fe bron bod fel insurance o ryw fath. If you haven't got a risk assessment, you may be liable for issues should they go wrong. So it is a sort of insurance document in a way to show that you've taken all reasonable measures, and that you've thought it through as to how you're going to minimize any risk. Because that's the other thing with things moving towards personal responsibility. You just wonder whether that opens the doors to perhaps the accident lawyers you see on telly moving into a new field of, no win, no fee.
Evian, things are difficult enough as they are without you bringing that in.
Wel, un cwestiwn bach ola wedyn, cyn bod ni'n symud ymlaen, yn gofyn os bod y rheolau wedyn yr un fath ar gyfer eglwysi hefyd fel lleoliadau cymunedol. So whether the rules are the same for churches as, they are also public spaces.
A mae yna canllawiau ar wahân wedi dod mas yn y gorffennol yn dosau ar gyfer eglwysi a capeli. There have been specific guidance that's come out before for churches and chapels. And I guess for very many organisations, we're doing this a little early. So there might be revisions once the announcements have been made on Friday. But one thing I would say, eto, un peth fydden ni'n gweud, i ni'n awyddus iawn I gadw pawb yn ddiogel, yndyn ni? We are all very, very keen to make sure that people are kept as safe as possible. So again, I would say for churches and chapels, we are potentially looking at, in some instances, individuals within the congregation that might be more vulnerable, might have certain health conditions, might need a little bit more consideration. So yes, I would say that distancing, particularly as Donna was saying, the cleaning in between activities, is really, really important. Mae fe'n bwysig gan fydd rhai bobl yn y gynulleidfa yn fregus ofnadw, felly mae fe'n bwysig iawn bod ni'n cadw pawb yn ddiogel yn diwedd.
So allai jyst gweud un peth arall ar hwnna. Mae asesiad risg, mae'n bwysig bod e mewn lle hefyd, oherwydd os oes rhywbeth ymlaen gall fod yn risg i lledaenu'r feirws, fe all y cyngor dal mynd mewn fel mae pethau ar hyn o bryd i rhwystro y digwyddiad na rhag mynd yn ei flaen. Mae pwerau gael gyda'r cyngor i dod i mewn i wneud hynny. Mae'n bwysig cofio bod y rheolau'n adael mewn lle, a falle mae'r ffaith bod y rheolau'n adael mewn lle yn dangos bod y cynulliad yn deall bod na dal risg sylweddol yn y gymuned. So yeah, again, the powers are there to stop events going ahead if needs be with the local authority, and if we feel that there is a risk, then that sort of action can be undertaken. Again, the first thing that we're going to be looking for is the risk assessment, and if you haven't got it, then it's more likely, if someone has raised concerns, it's more likely that we'd be considering stopping an event going ahead. So that's, again, just something else to bear in mind.
Diolch, Eifion. Again, you're not on your own. It's a rather complicated space at the moment. Mae fe'n lle eitha diddorol ar hyn o bryd yn diwe. I've heard many people say, actually, coming out from the easing of restrictions and moving into alert level 0 is probably harder than when we actually went into lockdown in the first place, in terms of trying to plan and prepare what we're doing in communities. Mae fe'n sefyllfa anodd ofnadw. Ond I chi ddim ar ben eich hunain. You are not on your own. As we've said before, there are lots of different templates, checklists on the Ceredigion County Council resources page for you to use and have been used in the past. We've also double-checked checklists and risk assessments on behalf of community centres and activities as well in the past. And if you do have any questions, then please contact CAFO, and then we can share with the panel and escalate to the events panel if you're organising a larger activity that will need slightly more consideration. Felly, os bod gyda chi unrhyw gwestiwn, unrhyw ymoliad, wedyn cysylltwch â CAFO. Fi'n siŵr wneud Teleri rhoid yn manylion cyswllt ni nawr yn y column chat. Teleri will put our contact details in the chat column, and we'll be able to share your query. Allwn ni rhannu eich ymoliad chi gyda'r panel a dod nôl ato chi. But planning is difficult. We don't know what will happen. We can't predict the future. Things can change very suddenly. So make sure that you do plan and prepare to make any last minute changes. Mae'r sefyllfa yn newid yn gyflym iawn yn diwedd, felly mae'n bwysig bod ni'n sicrhau bod ni'n cynllunio mewn ffordd sy'n rhwydd I wneud unrhyw newidiadau funud ola. But please don't go around your village halls or your community centres and rip down all the posters and all the information. Peidiwch mynd a tynnu popeth lawr. Dal yn bwysig bod ni'n atgoffa bobl yn arbennig os bod nhw ddim yn timlo'n hwylus, os bod gyda nhw symptomau, iddyn nhw ddim I fod yn rhan o unrhyw gyfarfod yn eu gweithgaredd. Really critical that we remind people that if they are feeling unwell or if they do have any symptoms, that they shouldn't be attending any events or activities, and they should be booking a test before they return to any community activities. And I think that's really important to remind people of that, particularly if you're planning activities in the autumn. It's always difficult, isn't it, to differentiate between cold and flu and some of the COVID symptoms, the original COVID symptoms. Felly, mae'r gwybodaeth na i'ch cefnogi chi, mae'r panel yma i'ch cefnogi chi. The information on the website is there to support you, and the panel are here to support you as well. CAFO do also have several grant schemes if you are in need of any financial support to make any changes or adjustments, or anything that you might need to do in the future. Felly mae yna cynlluniau grant gyda CAFO os fel yna unrhyw beth i chi sy'n newid, neu unrhyw gostau, unrhyw newidiadau i chi, mae angen i chi wneud i fod yn ddiogel. So yeah, finally, it's not gone away, but we can, if we do things with a due consideration, make sure that we restart our activities and we start bringing people together safely and in a way that ensures that we can continue to hold activities in the future. Felly mae'n holl bwysig bod ni'n ystyried beth sydd orau i ni wneud i sicrhau bod ni mewn sefyllfa i cynnal digwyddiadau yn y dyfodol. Felly diolch i chi am eich amser prynhawn yma, diolch i chi am eich cwestiynau, a diolch i'r panel am ei ymatebion. So thank you very, very much for your time this afternoon, for your questions, and to the panel for their continuing support. Felly cadwch mewn cysylltiad, keep in touch, and we'll share the link to the recording as soon as we can. Thank you very much. Bye now.